I just wanted to say three things on behalf of Big Brother Watch before we open this discussion up to the floor. The first is that I agree with the gentleman who said earlier this evening that the internet is not a private place. The internet is not a private space, and when you put information on the internet voluntarily, you are sharing that information. That is true. And that is why I often disappoint members of the Fourth Estate when they ring me up for a suitably slamming quote about something or other that's been taken from someone's public profile on whatever social media it is. And my first response is, what a fool they were to share that material. Because I believe privacy goes both ways. If you want to keep something private, the first thing to do is not to broadcast it on the internet. That having been said, the second thing I wanted to say was why I think Street View is different. And I, as Sarah and others know, I was interested in Street View as a privacy-intrusive concept before the Wi-Fi issue arose. Let me answer the gentleman from the Sunday Times. This is why I think you could see it walking down the street argument doesn't apply. You could say what you see on Street View is what you'd see walking down the street if you were 10 feet tall, had panopticonic vision, and had a memory capable of retaining everything in glorious technicolor, able to transmit it to the internet in perpetuity afterwards. The parallel doesn't really hold. In my view, when you have that sort of data retention then being broadcast on the internet, I think Rob Halfman is right. This is something that requires your consent when it goes up online. That's why a lot of the current discussion about Street View, despite the fact we're all interested in the Wi-Fi discussion, is still about the idea of the images being intrusive. From burglars who say in their confessions or police interviews or a mitigation on their behalf, they saw something was just too easy, it was just too tempting, because they saw it on Street View. For the case that we looked at, and it's catalogued on the Big Brother Watch website, and I don't mean to be emotive about it, but the Street View murder. The chap who broke into a house because it looked like a good prospect on Street View, the occupant of the home was there, and he wound up killing him. So I'm afraid that I don't think the argument, you could just see it walking down the street, really applies when it comes to Street View. And the third thing that I wanted to say is that this may be of interest particularly to members of the press, I don't know. I find it peculiar that the British Information Commissioner was so reluctant to investigate Google when so many other investigation commissioners were willing to have such an investigation. The reason I stress that is that the Metropolitan Police seem to think there was enough at least to begin an investigation to the criminal standard. If an investigation is warranted, I'm not saying anyone's guilty of anything so far, but if an investigation is warranted to the criminal standard, how can you possibly say our Information Commissioner should not have at least looked into what was going on in this country? And that's why I think our Information Commissioner is really, and no criticism of Google on this point, our Information Commissioner was really asleep on the job on that point. And his international fellows have really put him to shame. So that's another point I hope emerges from this debate. Not simply about Google, but about the people we entrust to protect us in privacy terms beyond this discussion. Because as everyone has really said, it won't just be Google. There will be other people in this sphere in times to come. We've got to make sure not only that people responsible for the technology are awake, but also the watchdogs are awake. That's my tuppence halfpenny. Now for anyone on the panel, any question, please. Madam at the back.
It's not exactly a question, but an observation that what bothers me is the claim that Google is making mistakes, because the first country where Street View was deployed was, of course, the States, and these same privacy questions and concerns were raised. And what bothers me is that Google did not learn from that and apply it to the future countries that it went on to deploy Street View in. Instead, we've seen the same exact set of debates play out over and over again in different countries. And, you know, I think Google needs to be seen to be learning from its mistakes and from the kinds of debates that grow up around its new services.
As you say, an observation. You want to say?
No, I would just observe that there's a culture within Google. I say this having just taken one trip to the Googleplex in Mountain View. My sense is that there is a rarefied atmosphere at a management level that Google works within, and I think it's difficult for Google to accept that it's it's fallible. I think at some levels of Google, there is no concept of screwing up. It's a little adolescent, but I'm just getting that feeling. I think that might be the problem with being a younger organisation.
Madam.
Has there been any potential or possibility that that data has been leaked to anyone? 3 years data, all those countries, has that ever come to mind?
I mean, my instinct is no.
I know
Google,
none.
Yeah, Google will probably firewall it pretty well.
Yeah,
I imagine.
One thing that could be said is the fact that whenever you have data within a company, they're always exposed to an inside risk, which is the biggest concern for any company is not outside the attack, because especially Google is really good at preventing them, but for any company are inside attacks, so people that may have access to databases with those data. On the other hand, I think Google is a large company that will have in place for sure a login system to see who
The banks have
gets
them and
in,
the
who
banks
gets
are
out. Yeah, so I don't know, but it can be. I mean, it's of course if you keep the data, there is always a risk that somebody gets.
Because they say the Chinese attacked the Mountain View computers.
Do you want to expand? Do you want to explain what you mean? Because some people won't know what.
Oh, well, it depends whose view you take. Sarah might be able to sort of, she will be a lot more attuned to all this than me. But as I understand it, Google did the big pullout of China. And one of the pretexts for doing so was that there had been an assertion that the Chinese had hacked into Mountain View Gmail systems. Now, there's been some interesting retraction of that subsequently, and I can't work out what the current thinking is, but Sarah, do you know what Google's current position is on
I was
that?
going to say, alongside Wi-Fi, China is the other subject, which really I'm not allowed to talk about, for equally scary reasons, frankly. But yes, we did have an attack from a Chinese location onto our services, which is one of the reasons we pulled out. Details about who did that and what specific services they attacked, I don't know.
All I would say about the dangers innate of having enormous data sets is to make the obvious comparison in the United Kingdom, which is with the state, which accumulates enormous data sets and it doesn't look after them very well. There is, to my knowledge, only been one proper audit of the NHS, which accumulates a comparably large amount of data like that about individual citizens. In Leeds, in a hospital trust in 2006, they did it for a single month. I'm not saying Google's anything like this, but it's useful to know how data sets get abused. They did it in Leeds for a single month, in the data retained by the hospital trust in private records. And they found in that single month there were some 70,000 inappropriate accesses of people's medical records. So nurses to spying on doctors, doctors spying on nurses, everyone spying on celebrities, and people looking up their neighbours. And the answer in the NHS was the typical one for bureaucrats when they encounter that level of abuse: stop auditing. I, for one, am happy that we can have an open dialogue with Google in a way that you can't with the NHS on this point. Next question.
My first reaction to what you said was celebrities in Leeds, but
Cheap shots.
The question I want to ask is a simple one of fact. I mean, I understood from the newspaper reports that the Street View access to Wi-Fi data was only on accounts that were not password protected. Is that the case? Because that is the case, and it's a bit like the Facebook issue. If you broadcast your stuff without password protection, you shouldn't.
Okay, all I would say about that is that Facebook profiles are different from from being encrypted or unencrypted on Wi-Fi. People may be silly to broadcast on unencrypted Wi-Fi, but you still have a reasonable expectation people aren't going to hack into that. You may be more vulnerable, but to my mind, it's a bit like saying your gran shouldn't walk out at night because she's more likely to be robbed. She didn't volunteer to be robbed. She's simply more vulnerable.
It may be more like, I could get your data if you don't protect it by standing at the end of your street, standing outside your front gate with my MacBook.